Welcome to Bullet Point Battles. In this series I'm going to share with you my interest in military history and a lifetime hobby of military modelling in miniature. I am first going to set the scene and then move on to the recreation of the famous Battle of Rorke's Drift, which took place in the Zulu War of 1879. All the figures are at 1 to 72nd scale, and I have Zulus, thousands of them. The background history to the battle includes decades of friction between native tribes, notably the Zulus, Dutch settlers known as Boers, as well as the imperial power of Britain. Britain needed stability in South Africa to protect the important sea route around the Cape to the imperial jewel in the crown, India. Any threat to this security had to be eliminated, and 40,000 plus potentially hostile Zulu warriors adjacent to the colony of Natal was deemed such a threat. The two men in overall charge at the time of the conflict were Sir Henry Bartle Frere, British High Commissioner for South Africa, and the King of the Zulus, Cetshwayo. The war began in January 1879. Disastrously for the British, on the 22nd they suffered a resounding defeat inflicted by a large, well-disciplined Zulu army at Isandlwana. The two men commanding the opposing forces on the day were Frederick Augustus Thesiger, Lord Chelmsford. Although he wasn't at Isandlwana, he was on his way to the Zulu capital of Ulundi at the time, and the Zulu chief Untinshingweo. Later on the same day, about 4,000 Zulus, who'd been in reserve but not fought, crossed the Buffalo River, which was the Natal border. Their intention was to attack the British supply camp at the mission station of Rorke's Drift. The Zulus were led at Rorke's Drift by Dubalamanzi, half-brother of the Zulu king, and the British defenders were led by Lieutenant John Marriott Chard and Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead. This is what the Buffalo River used to look like in 1879. It's a contemporary photograph with Rorke's Drift in the foreground and the mountain of Isandlwana in the distance. Rorke's Drift across the Buffalo River, taken some time after the battle. The mission station can be seen on the skyline to the left. The Zulu name for the Buffalo River is the Umzinyathi, and if you were to visit Rorke's Drift today, depending on the time of year, it would look very much like this. This is Shiani Hill, also known as Oscarberg, which overlooks the mission station at Rorke's Drift, which is on the extreme right. To the left is the Buffalo River and Rorke's Drift crossing. I am trying to make it as historically accurate as miniature modelling will allow. I have based it upon this sketch, which was drawn immediately after the battle by Lieutenant Chard, who was the senior British officer on the day of the battle. In the distance you can see the Oscarberg terraces and the caves which held Zulu riflemen during the battle. In order to get the details of the battle as accurate as I reasonably can, I've obviously done some research using the internet, as well as the old-fashioned way of using some fantastic publications which are out there, and I recommend to anyone who's interested in the subject. Some compromises in the construction of the model were greatly reducing the size of Shiani Hill and bringing it closer to get the caves onto the model. Also, I have moved the rough cattle kraal to the west, although it is shown exactly there in a sketch by Lieutenant Colonel Creelock of Russell's Mounted Infantry, who arrived at Rorke's Drift on the morning of the 23rd of January. These are the Oscarberg terraces on Shiani Hill today. The bell tower is reputed to be where Dubalamanzi stood in the early part of the battle. These are my representations of the caves on Oscarberg terraces in miniature. Lieutenant General Frederick Thesiger, Lord Chelmsford, seen here in a portrait, how he was depicted in film and how he appears in my representation. He passed through Rorke's Drift on his way to Ulundi. Untishingweo, Victor Etisandalwana, seen here in a portrait, how he is depicted in film and how he appears briefly in my representation. He almost undoubtedly neither ordered nor sanctioned the attack on Rorke's Drift. These are photographs of Lieutenant Chard, Lieutenant Bromhead and Dubalamanzi, how they appear on film and how I've depicted them in my reconstruction.
Sound the alert.
In the peaceful days before the war, Rorke's Drift was home to Otto Witt, a Swedish missionary, his wife Ellen and their 3 young daughters, the eldest of whom was 7 years old. Behind their house was a church building, hence the location was a mission station. Situated on a main route and very close to one of the river border crossing points between Natal and Zululand. It had previously been a trading post owned by James Rorke. Otto Witt often visited Zululand, but his spiritual message was less important to them than the practical commodities from a trader. There was a garden, presumably for cultivating fruit and vegetables. Evidence has also been found that chickens were kept, as well as local breeds of sheep and some newer breeds. Adjacent to the church was a well-built stone kraal, which is a place for keeping livestock. Also close by was a much larger, rough stone kraal for cattle. Quechua said about Rorke's Drift, "First came the trader, then came the missionary, then came the Red Soldiers." During December 1878, Lord Chelmsford undertook the planning of a campaign to invade Zululand, defeat the Zulus and capture Quechua. He also had to resolve a complicated logistical supply problem for the army, which he had started to assemble at Helpmachar, about 20 miles from Rorke's Drift. Supply bases had to be established, and Rorke's Drift seemed an ideal location. Soldiers arrived at Rorke's Drift, and the site was requisitioned by the army, and supplies began to arrive. Otto Witt could see the way the wind was blowing, so he decided to send his family to safety, 40 miles away at Umsinga. They left in a wagon with a single trustworthy native servant, and they were all reunited at Pietermaritzburg soon afterwards. Once the mission station had been requisitioned, Otto Witt's residence was used as a hospital and the church was converted into a store. The British government had not wanted war in South Africa. Their main concern at the time was playing what was called the Great Game with the Russians, who were making advances towards Afghanistan and threatening India. Consequently, Chelmsford could only go to war with the forces he had currently in South Africa, and those he could recruit locally, which included colonials and natives, of perhaps about 16,000 men in total. Since ancient times, it has been known that strategy is nothing without logistics to support it. With this in mind, Chelmsford planned for a 4-month campaign and assessed he needed 1,800 tons of supplies. To move this, he had been able to procure 977 wagons, 56 carts, 10,023 draft oxen, 803 horses and 398 mules. A further 2,000 extra natives were employed to manage and drive them. In January 1879, the Buffalo River was in flood, and the roads, such as they were muddy. Chelmsford decided that a single column would be too long, slow, drawn out, and thus vulnerable to attack. So he divided his forces into 5 columns, 3 to enter Zulu land and converge on Ulundi, and the other 2 in reserve, to guard potentially vulnerable areas and to be available as required. Chelmsford himself was to lead number 3 column across Rorke's Drift into Zululand. He made camp there in early January. Despite his considerations, he was soon to find that no plan survives contact with the enemy. Lord Chelmsford set off for Zululand and Ulundi on the 11th of January at the head of number 3 column. This consisted of core infantry elements of the 1st Battalion 24th Regiment, less 4 companies, and the 2nd Battalion 24th Regiment, less 1 company, which would remain on garrison duty at Rorke's Drift. Also of significant importance for rapid mobility and scouting duties were the mounted units. They consisted of 1 squadron of the Imperial Mounted Infantry, 1 squadron of the Natal Mounted Police, who had been commandeered by the Army, and 1 squadron of Colonial Mounted Volunteers. Attending to the general engineering works was an advance party of the 5th Field Company of Royal Engineers. Heavy firepower was provided by N Battery 5th Brigade of the Royal Field Artillery, with 6 7-pounders and 2 rocket troughs. A major part of the invasion column was made up of local recruits. 1 company of Natal native pioneers to assist with engineering and maintenance works, and these were the only ones to be issued with uniforms. The final element of the field force were 2 battalions of the Natal native contingent. To distinguish them from the Zulus, they wore a red ribbon round their hats or foreheads. The supply chain required to maintain this force in the field consisted of hundreds of wagons, also thousands of draft animals which would require rest and grazing along the way. Many hundreds of native levies were engaged, as well as a number of local colonials and Boers who knew the terrain and Zulu language. Even as Lord Chelmsford and number 3 column left for Zululand, supplies continued to build up at Rorke's Drift. B Company of the 2nd Battalion of the 24th Foot had been left on garrison duty. Together with native levies, they turned the mission station into a supply depot. They built a cookhouse and installed 2 sets of ovens to the rear of the former church and residence buildings. Supplies included a large number of 200-pound mealie bags of Indian corn, tins of meat in cases and boxes of biscuits, and 20,000 rounds of ammunition. All these would prove very necessary in the coming battle. In the days between the 11th and 22nd of January, Rorke's Drift had become quite a substantial supply base. Also, the hospital facility was being used by people who were injured in skirmishes with the Zulus before the Battle of Isandlwana. B Company, who had been left behind on garrison duty at Rorke's Drift, were also a little dismayed that they weren't going to be part of the action against the Zulus. All they had to look forward to was kicking dust and the next meal. Lieutenant Chard had already been once lucky on the 22nd of January, in that he had gone to Isandlwana early in the morning to get clarification of his orders. As he was not required, he had returned with his wagon and driver Robson to Rorke's Drift. At about 9:30 he had crossed paths with Lieutenant Colonel Durnford, commander of No. 2 Column. Durnford had been ordered to Isandlwana with his 5 troops of Natal Native Horse, 2 companies of Natal Native Contingent, and Major Russell's rocket battery. The rest of the 2 Natal Native Contingent battalions remained behind in reserve. Quechua did not want war with the British, but he knew his warriors were itching to wash their spears. He gathered the chiefs in the royal kraal at Alundi, including Mtishingweo and Dubulamanzi. The decision was made to lock horns with the invaders. From Isandlwana, Chelmsford and a large part of No. 3 Column had moved on towards Alundi in search of the Zulu army. Those remaining at the camp amounted to about 1,500 men of both regulars and natives. They were attacked at about 11:30 in the morning and were overwhelmed by 15,000 Zulus and almost annihilated to a man by 2 in the afternoon. Most of those few who escaped were on horseback. Although it was a victory for the Zulus, the cost was great, with the loss of at least 3,000 Zulu warriors. Quechua lamented that there were not enough tears to mourn the dead. This is a memorial erected to the Zulus in 1999. The British cairns appeared in the months after the battle, and the memorial was erected in 1910. 4 reserve regiments of Zulus had missed the action at Isandlwana. They were the Uthulwana, the Indlondlo, the Udloko, and the Indluyengwe, and they were all relatively senior warriors. They wanted to attack the Redcoats at Kwajimu, Jim's farm, as they called Rorke's Drift, and they were all chomping at the bit. Dubulamanzi reluctantly signalled the advance against the orders of Quechua not to enter Natal. It is doubtful if he could have stopped them, even if he'd wanted to. At about 2 o'clock, Surgeon Reynolds and the Reverends Otto Witt and George Smith were observing the terrain towards Isandlwana from the top of Shiani Hill. They first see men in the far distance who are indistinguishable, and Surgeon Reynolds becomes concerned there may be an influx of battle casualties, so heads back alone to camp. At 2:30, a message from Captain Alan Gardner, who had escaped from Isandlwana, warning that Zulus were on their way to attack Rorke's Drift, had been given to a mounted infantryman to take there. Lieutenant Bromhead received this message at about 3 o'clock. Also at around 2:30, George Smith and Otto Witt could see 3 bodies of about 1,000 to 1,500 men each coming their way. They were still unaware that these were Zulus. These were the Indlondlo, Udloko and Ulfulwana regiments. The younger men of the Indluyengwe had taken a different route and could not yet be seen. They would be the first to arrive at Rorke's Drift. At about 3 o'clock, Smith realised that these bodies of men were Zulus, and he and Witt hightailed it back to the mission station and got back there at about 3:45. At about 3 o'clock, 2 fugitive riders from the battle arrive at the river where Lieutenant Chard is working on the ponts. They inform him of the disaster at Isandlwana. One of them is Lieutenant Gert Adendorf of the Natal Native Contingent. Lieutenant Bromhead has also received Captain Gardner's message about the approaching Zulus and has sent for Chard while he is still talking to Adendorf. Before Chard runs back up from the river to the post, he notices about 50 Natal Native Contingent assigned to guard the ponts has already melted away. At 3:20, Reynolds, Bromhead and other officers, along with Commissary Dalton, are urgently discussing options when Lieutenant Chard arrives. Evacuate or stand and fight? Those are the questions. It is believed Commissary Dalton, a well-experienced soldier, persuaded them that staying put was better than being caught in the open. especially with wounded and sick men in the hospital who might have to be abandoned, which was unthinkable. The decision was made to stand and fight, and at 3:30 Lieutenant Chard issued orders to build makeshift barricades. These were to be out of the 200-pound mealie bags and the biscuit and meat boxes weighing about half that, as well as lime and rum barrels. The gaps between the store and the hospital, into which loopholes had been formed, and around the open perimeter of the compound. A defensible position about 150 yards long by 30 yards wide was created. This work was mainly undertaken by local levies, a company of the Natal native contingent, and the regular soldiers of B Company not on other duties. B Company's 2 wagons for their tents and ammunition were also incorporated into the defensive wall. The fires in the camp were doused out, and the tents started to be struck to give a clearer line of fire. The perimeter secured with 4-foot walls of mealie bags, all this done as quickly as muscle power would allow. At 3:45, when the Reverends Otto Witt and George Smith arrived back from Shiani Hill with news of the approaching Zulus, the preparations for the defence were already well underway. Otto Witt, being a civilian, decided his best course of action was to join up with his family in Masinga. Smith might have considered going with him, but his horse was missing, and so was his groom. So Smith stayed and participated in the defence. A steady stream of fugitive escapees from the disaster at Isandlwana brought doom-laden accounts of what had happened, also what anyone in the Zulu's way could expect. This was obviously unnerving and unsettling and greatly disturbed everyone, particularly the local natives at the camp. After Otto Witt had left, the perimeter was closed off with mealie bags. In front of the hospital building, the first line of mealie bags was lower than the rest, and Chard had considered this vulnerable, so a second wall was built behind. A return wall closed up the gap between the second wall and the end of the hospital. At 4 o'clock, Lieutenant Henderson arrived from the direction of Isandlwana with about 100 mounted natives, the Tolokoa from Dunford's force. They were understandably nervous and on edge, but still in good order. Chard asked Henderson to ride out past Shiani Hill to observe the Zulus and delay them if possible. At 4:15, a brief burst of firing could be heard beyond Shiani Hill. Looking northeast from inside the perimeter and south towards Shiani Hill and the terraces, the Zulus would first appear around the shoulder of Shiani Hill. At 4:20, Lieutenant Bromhead sent Private Hitch onto the roof of the store to keep watch out for the Zulus. About the same time, Henderson's force came galloping back towards the post. They continued past and on to safety. Not only was this a loss of potential defenders, but the native levies and the Natal native contingent took to their heels and fled en masse. The British force now amounted to about 100 fit men and around 30 wounded or sick in the hospital. Robson, Chard's wagon driver, also fled towards the caves and was able to hide there undiscovered for the duration of the battle. The wall of mealie bags on top of a rocky ledge to the north, together with stone buildings and kraal, actually made a considerable obstacle for the Zulus. Combined with volley fire from the garrison soldiers, as well as Martini Henry rifles with long bayonets, the momentum of the Zulus could be blunted. The Zulu way of fighting, apart from those armed with rifles and muskets of dubious accuracy, was to quickly get up close with shield and stabbing spear, which was very effective, as was proved that morning. The defences went a long way to nullify this skill, making the eventual level of bravery of the attacking Zulus even more outstanding. As soon as Lieutenant Chard knew he was down to only 100 fit men, he realised the perimeter as constructed would be too long to hold indefinitely. He ordered the construction of another improvised wall of biscuit and tinned meat boxes straight across the compound from the end of the store to the north wall of mealie bags. This reduced the perimeter by 2/3 should the need arise. A water barrel had also been filled and located near the 2 wagons in the defence line. The soldiers had just begun to put the second tier of boxes on this new wall when they heard Hitch shouting the Zulus had arrived. Hitch spots the Zulus when they are about 800 yards from the post and shouts a warning. The Zulus are jogging in silence. This was the Indluyengwe regiment of many hundreds of men, an innumerable swarm according to Surgeon Reynolds, thick as grass to another. They fanned out without breaking pace, with many warriors with rifles heading towards the caves where they overlooked the post. The others headed directly towards the south wall defences between the hospital and the store. While they were building the barricades, they were probably preoccupied. I don't think we can even imagine today what must have been going through their minds as they waited for the Zulu onslaught. Thousands against 100, and knowing the fate that had befallen their comrades that morning. Chard and Bromhead had made sure they were as ready as they could possibly have been. At 4:30, the Indluyengwe approached the south wall without changing pace and moved resolutely towards the defenders. At about 400 yards, the first shots are exchanged, the Zulus firing at Private Hitch on the roof of the store over his head, and the soldiers into the approaching mass of Zulus. The soldiers kept up a relentless fire as the Zulus headed towards the south wall. Many of the warriors with rifles and muskets made for the caves on the Oscarburg terraces. They fired down on the British from there. Such was the rate of fire from the defenders that many Zulus in the lead were felled. This caused the momentum to stall, and the Zulus took cover behind the cookhouse and ovens, went to ground, or veered to their left around the hospital building. The British defenders were able to maintain a disciplined and accurate fire on the Zulus still facing the south wall. The responding fire from the Zulus in the caves either fell short or went high. The Indluyengwe had arrived before the other 3 regiments and had swung immediately into the attack. The first thrust at the south wall had been checked when the Zulus had got to within 30 yards. The warriors following bypassed the south wall and went straight on to start encircling the hospital and west wall. Musket and rifle fire was maintained from the Oscarburg terraces. The defenders in the hospital and on the north veranda inside the perimeter made ready to repel the attackers in the same way as the south wall. The Zulu momentum had been checked facing the south wall by accurate rifle fire. The impetus was switched to the Zulus' left, and they surged around the hospital building towards the west and north walls of the post. The rocky ledge and walls of mealie bags with armed soldiers behind made an even more formidable obstacle than the south wall. There was no doubting their bravery as they immediately assaulted the defences. The Zulus, armed with rifles and muskets, veered right towards the caves on the Oscarburg terraces. From there they were able to fire down on the soldiers manning the north wall. Not the greatest of shots, but managed to inflict a few casualties on the British. When Duplamanzi arrived, he stationed himself above the caves to observe and give command. At about 4:50, the other 3 Zulu regiments arrived from around the shoulder of Shiani Hill. They saw the direction the Indluyengwe had taken and followed them apace, around the end of the west wall of the hospital. They immediately launched an attack on the northwest end of the compound. Surgeon Reynolds commented that things were getting nasty, very nasty. Zulus were moving to encircle the post. They had sufficient numbers to do it. The defenders at the west end were now in the heat of the action. At 5 o'clock, along the south wall, the Zulus had got to the cover of the hospital building. A few had pressed home their attack on the mealie bag and wagon defence line between the hospital and the store. The British line was holding. Between 5:15 and 5:30, the Zulus were assaulting the west wall and using the rocky ledge and stone wall as cover, moving steadily along the north wall. This was the most vulnerable part of the defence, and some Zulus got over. Insufficient numbers of them to overcome the defenders, and they were quickly dispatched. Lieutenants Chard and Bromhead had organised an agile reinforcing section, and along with the two of them they engaged Zulus who managed to get over the mealie bags. The Zulu pressure on this part of the wall, however, was mounting. There were so many Zulus on the attack that there was not enough room for them all to get at the barricade. Their sheer numbers meant they had to stream past their fellow combatants to get to their own piece of the perimeter. At this point in the battle, there were a number of British casualties caused by the close-quarter Zulu musket fire rather than their spears. At the western end of the defences, the Zulus had breached the wall and were into the compound. Fighting was now hand to hand. At about 5:40, the soldiers withdrew to behind the cross wall of mealie bags. Although this shortened the perimeter, the hospital building was now left exposed and vulnerable and almost surrounded by Zulus. At around 6 o'clock, another attack on the mealie bags next to the hospital veranda was repulsed, but Chard realised it was only a matter of time before they were swamped by the Zulus. Chard gave the order to withdraw to the second line of defence behind the biscuit boxes and tinned meat boxes. This move isolated the few able-bodied men in the hospital, as well as the sick and wounded. It had to be done for the safety of the rest of the defenders. The defenders in the hospital were able to keep up a resolute fighting defence, and withdrew from each room through holes made in the internal walls to get to the east end of the building. These men were unaware of their predicament, and no orders had been given to evacuate. At around 6:30, the Zulus inadvertently gave the occupants of the hospital notice to leave by setting fire to the thatched roof. The fire and smoke essentially forced the defenders out. Most of them were lucky enough to escape through the east window of the hospital and across the open compound. Covering fire was provided by their comrades behind the biscuit and meat box barricade. At 7:10, Lieutenant Chard ordered the construction of a mealie-bag redoubt within the final perimeter out of the remaining piles of mealie bags in front of the store. This was to provide a location for a last stand, and this structure was completed by 8:15. At 7:40, the last of the brave defenders, including Privates Hook and Williams, escaped from the hospital and left it to the Zulus and the flames. All the British were now within the short defensive perimeter in front of the store, including the well-built cattle kraal. At 7:45, the Zulus launched an attack on the compound at the junction of the north mealie-bag wall and the biscuit box barricade. A steady fire from the Zulus on Shiani Hill was also directed at this point. All the defenders in this area were wounded, including Private Hitch, seriously. Miraculously, Lieutenant Bromhead avoided injury, although he was in the thick of it. Ferdinand Schiess was also conspicuously brave and effective in this area, and the Zulus were repulsed again. The Zulus were brave and not stupid. They moved en masse towards the rough stone kraal under cover, while the attack on the post north wall continued. At 8:30, the Zulus assaulted the post from the east side towards the defenders in the well-built stone kraal. It was beginning to get dark, but the glow from the blazing hospital building provided light for the defenders. The Zulus were also trying to set fire to the store roof, but were foiled by Ardendorf and others defending. From 9:30, the Zulu attacks seemed to be waning. They withdrew from the perimeter and could be heard singing and chanting to wind themselves up for further attacks. Inaccurate but disturbing rifle and musket fire continued from the Zulus on Shiani Hill. At 10 o'clock, they attacked the stone kraal again with tremendous force and beat the defenders out of the well-built kraal back into the main compound. The hospital flames flared up and illuminated the Zulus, and intense rifle fire from the defenders drove them away again with heavy losses. At 10:15, apart from the occasional rifle shot, the Zulus have gone quiet, and even this ceases by midnight. At about that time, Lieutenant Bromhead and some men go over the barricade and bring the water cart close and attach a hose. This is the first water for some of the men in hours of fighting. No reaction from the Zulus, and the hospital building has just about burnt out. At 4 a.m, after 3 or 4 hours of silence, apart from the odd rifle shot, the Zulus break their night cover and gradually withdraw. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the defenders' hearts sank again when a large group of Zulus reappeared on the hillside. Lieutenant Chard knew the soldiers had only the ammunition left in their pouches, and there was one box left in the store. They manned their posts again and waited. At 8 o'clock, the Zulus departed because, unseen to the defenders of the mission station, the remains of No. 3 column, led by Lord Chelmsford, was observed returning to Rorke's Drift, so the Zulus headed home. Lieutenant Chard had already ordered the removal of the thatch from the store in case the Zulus returned. At the end of the battle on the morning of the 23rd of January, the total number of casualties of the action on the British side was 17. About 350 fallen Zulus were counted around the battle site, and it was suspected many more succumbed to their wounds later. Of the 20,000 rounds of ammunition, 19,000 had been expended. 11 VCs were awarded to the defenders, the most in any single action in British history. I have orientated the aerial shot of the model to align with the plan of the battle. All the defence features are there, and the grey arrows indicate the actual sequence and directions of the Zulu attacks demonstrated. So there you have it, the Battle of Rorke's Drift. I hope you enjoyed it. This painting is by Alphonse de Neuville, called The Defence of Rorke's Drift 1879, and it's very evocative. A picture is worth 1,000 words.